have the presentation shared.
You can see it. So welcome everybody, and also people watching this recording later. This is part of a webinar series organized by HL7 Finland to introduce IHE profiles that are related to HL7 FHIR. And I think this is the fourth installation. We have the 3 previous ones recorded on HL7 Finland's website. And this will end up there as well. But let's go to it. So, John, please.
Yes, hello. John Moehrke. I am a consultant with BioLite, but more important for here, I'm co-chair of the IHE IT Infrastructure Committee, and also a member in HL7 of Security and Fire Core and FMG. So what I'm going to be going through today is the sharing of IPS. It's a particular profile that is kind of high level, so it might be a good introduction. It covers a lot of ground. So I'm going to turn off my video at this point and focus on the content. All right, so first up. So I'm going to cover the foundations of IPS and how IHE and HL7 and others participate together. Going to do some foundation of document sharing. We did a previous presentation that goes a little bit deeper than this, but I wanted to do some introduction to that. Going to go into specifically what is the sharing of IPS profile. What are the specifics of that? And then I'm going to then cover some other relevant profiles around the use of these IPS in the document sharing environment, including specifically how can I actually see this data using FHIR RESTful queries rather than always having to deal with documents and having to deal with a depth of documents. And then IHE, of course, focuses on testing, so we'll get to testing as well. So first up, IPS is a cross-SDO initiative. It is not the sole work of one standards organizations. ISO and CEN, HL7, IHE, SNOMED, and there's some others that are related, but it's really an unprecedented collaboration. And each standards organization highlights the strengths of that particular standards organization. So CEN and ISO provide the specification that defines the data model and the IPS content. What is the need? What are the content that must be part of this? What are the optionalities that should be there? HL7 contributes 2 different concrete implementations, one using CDA as the encoding mechanism, the other one using FHIR document as the encoding mechanism. I'm going to kind of be more focused on the FHIR document, but the distinction from a IHE document sharing perspective is really immaterial, so to speak. It's just a MIME type difference. SNOMED provides the free terminology set from SNOMED for the use cases, and then IHE supplies the profiles designed for further addressing implementations like transport, like moving it from one place to another, the security, the privacy, the ways to protect it, and then further rigorous testing at connectathons. So what is the IPS? Just been talking about it as an acronym. It is a standards-based set of basic clinical data. You see this nice little colored pencil. It certainly has medications and allergies and problems, immunization results and procedures in it. It can carry other things, but this graphic is really something that the IPS community focuses around to really say, hey, these fundamental things that are always needed to have fresh and available for healthcare are absolutely a focus of IPS. It certainly includes any other care-related facts that are commonly needed to treat this patient. So it is a summarization of the patient's clinical data. And in so being a summary, it might not have the depth. It won't have everything, except if the patient really doesn't have much data, but it's a summarization. So it may only go back a certain number of years for some data. Other data, it may be completely comprehensive, like allergies. There wouldn't be a cutoff on those kinds of things. So the International Patient Summary is a minimal and non-exhaustive set of basic clinical data of a patient. It is specialty agnostic. It is condition independent, though it contains condition information, but it is readily usable by all clinicians in an unscheduled cross-border patient care. That was the original focus, was unscheduled cross-border patient care, but we're learning that it's used for things beyond that as well. So the International Patient Summary is this extract. It's a snapshot in time. It is about the subject of care. It is internationally scoped, so there's no particular region that has precedent over what goes into an IPS, but we do expect that, like many specifications, it will be customized for a particular region. And there's already plenty of regions that are adding their own little specialization to say, hey, within our region, this piece of information is a must versus just available to put there, those kinds of things. And we're seeing that it's being used not just in cross-border, but we're seeing it used within a region. We're seeing it used, pulled for emergent care. We're seeing it used, across states or cities, or even just across organizations that are within the same region. It is that general usable. So last slide on what is IPS. There is a website that the IPS community, this group of standards organizations under the Joint Initiative Council, started in 2021. It contains all kinds of things. It contains the pointers to the specifications, educational research, resources, implementation, stakeholder benefits. A different copy of this presentation is even there. All right. Next on the agenda, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I'm going to move into what is this thing called IHE document sharing. I've gone deeper on this in a previous presentation. You can pull that up to get it deeper, but I'm just kind of going to give some fundamentals so that we have a place to hang on to. So the grandfather of document sharing is XDS, cross-enterprise document sharing. It was ground shaking at the time. It basically said, hey, if there is a regional need to share health information within that regional need, like a state or a region of a country, they would need things like patient identity management. How can I know what is the patient identity that I should use? What are the other organizations that are within this affinity domain that know this patient? And then it contains this document registry that contains metadata about the documents that are available. Metadata being high-level information, but information necessary for discovery, like I want to find medical summaries, or I want to find discharge summaries, or I want to find lab reports. So those kinds of metadata of what kind of content is there, what time frame does that document cover? Oh, this is a very old document. It's not interesting to me. Oh, this is the one that was done last month. Those kinds of metadata are available in the registry that's centrally located. The documents themselves are not necessarily centrally located. The documents are those little bitty silos with the orange doors. Those documents are oftentimes maintained at the source. Sometimes they're not even documents yet. They are the document registry holds a metadata promise to create a medical summary. And if you request a medical summary, a brand new one gets made from current information and current policy and current algorithms on how to put together a medical summary. So fundamentally, that's what document sharing is about. Like I said, it can deal with static documents. It can deal with dynamic documents on demand. It is really content agnostic. When we first started XDS, CCR was an emerging standard, and at the time, XDS had no problem with CCR. It's just a different MIME type, but it can be described with the metadata. CDA is a prime one that is used, but PDF, text files, DICOM objects, all kinds of content can be registered. And indeed, from an XDS perspective, the formal CDA definition of a document doesn't really apply. It's best if it does. It best is that it covers all of those principles of a document. But from a document sharing environment with IHE, it just needs to be some content that can be described with metadata. So quite literally, it could be just the list of medications and not even have any document header. So that could be a document as far as XDS is considered. So once we had one domain, we of course needed a way to say, oh man, there's more than one domain in the world. So how do we federate out queries such that we find the patient identities across all of these? We use XCPD for that. And how do I find documents that are available? And how do I retrieve those documents? That's within XCA. It uses the same metadata model, uses the same patient identity cross-referencing concepts. It is based more on SOAP, and therefore there is some concern that it's not a great new technology to pick up. FHIR is clearly the new technology to pick up. So both with the XDS and with XCA, we're looking at using purely FHIR, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But so don't be afraid by these. They are just the originals. There are FHIR-based mechanisms as well. The other thing, though, that we do have within document sharing is we have some totally different modalities. Those were about publishing and query and retrieve. We also have some push models. So where the document source knows the destination recipient. mXDE is available for all of these environments, but there's an mXDE push that can be used by a document source to push the content, the FHIR, using FHIR RESTful push to a specific document recipient. XDR is the SOAP-based mechanism. The XDR is very related to the source XDS transaction, so it was reused. And then we have this XDM, which is all about how do I persist this stuff into some media. It might be a USB memory stick. It might be an email. It might be some other file system. So XDM is all about putting the exact same metadata and documents onto some media so I can exchange the media. And as you can see, the little man carrying around the data, this would be one of those cases. That little man could be the patient, little man could be a courier, what have you. One of the important things leading up to this point is, I mentioned earlier that the principles of a document from CDA are not a limit to XDS or document sharing in general. But I'm going to point out now that these principles are extremely important, especially to the publisher of data. Because the publisher of data gets to own the persistence. So if they need to replace it or they need to make it available, principles of a document is that it has some persistence. It has a unique identifier that is always about that set of bits. It has stewardship. Who is the maintainer? When was this created? Where is it managed? It has authenticatability. How do I know that I got the whole thing? How do I know that it was assembled under some policy? It has context of not just the patient, but it has context of where did this data come from? What were the care settings? What were the encounter contexts of the information? Um, it has this wholeness. So you don't just have a set of observations, some of which were made in the home, some of which were made in a clinic, some of which were made in a clinical study, but you have the context of those observations as well. So wholeness is an important principle of a document. And then there is some human readability aspect to a document. So these principles of a document are important, and I would encourage them whenever sharing documents because they do come in as important over time. If you're just going to pull data and use it and throw it away, they're not that important, but when it comes to sharing information into a health information exchange, these principles are very important, especially to the publisher. Doesn't mean they're not important to the consumer. The consuming application also needs to know, how do I know the provenance of this information? How do I know that I got everything? So they are important to the consumer, but they're more important to the publisher of the data. I talked about metadata. This is a nice, pretty, colorful chart of the kinds of metadata. So you can see it's not comprehensive, but there's pieces of information in there for descriptive, like I said before, which is things like you would want to find medical summaries or discharge summaries, those kinds of things. Patient identity, what was that patient's information when this document was published 10 years ago? What's the provenance? Who was the author? When was it created? Those kinds of information. Privacy and security elements, including some integrity checks of hash and size, but also some information around the confidentiality codes assigned to the document. And you can see, so there's a bunch of metadata that are there for various reasons, and if you'll look closely, you'll notice that many of these metadata elements show up in multiple places. And that's just because, metadata often has multiple purposes. One of the important parts of document sharing is that it's not just simply about content, but that it is about a variety of content. So you can have, for any particular patient, you can have text files and CDA files, you can have PDFs, you can have JPEGs, you can have all kinds of different flavors of content for any particular patient. But the metadata helps you understand what that data is. One of the important additional functionalities of the document sharing concept is that there are relationships in the metadata. So you can have more than one version of a document registered, and that, for example, version 1, version 2, version 3, those would have a replaces relationship. So if you happen to be pointing at one of them and you see that the metadata says, there's a different entry that replaces this one, you now know how to navigate to the latest version of the document. But the version that you know is there, so that you can determine what was the data that you did pull at that time. There's also a transforms relationship, and the blue diagram is kind of showing that. So in this case, the EMR is publishing primarily a FHIR IPS, but it is also publishing a transform of that into CDA IPS, into PDF. So these 4 boxes on the right are in a transforms relationship with the primary. And in this way, if somebody finds a document entry, but they really don't know how to consume a FHIR IPS, but they do know how to consume a CDA, they can trans the bridge there to get to the CDA version or the PDF version. So these relationships are in there as well. And then there's also a relationship for signing. So we have a document digital signature profile that enables you to sign any content. And the signature is either an XML signature object, a document, or now a JSON signature object that has a signs relationship to the thing that it signs. So again, these relationships are important. And then under special, I mentioned on-demand documents before. On-demand is used when usually with things just like medical summaries, where, hey, I can give you a fresh copy of this if you ask for it, but I do also have the previous ones I handed out. They're over here with a relationship. There's a delayed assembly special case as well for things like discharge summaries, where at discharge an entry could be recorded that says, hey, I can make a discharge summary, but I'm not going to make one if nobody wants it. So you register a delayed document assembly metadata, and if someone comes along and requests the document, you assemble the document, and then you replace the metadata with pointers to the document content that you have. So delayed assembly enables you to indicate that there are documents available that haven't yet been made but could be. At this point, I'm going to say there's a bunch of other profiles. I've spoken to a few of these as we're talking, like XCPD, right there in the middle of the screen. XCPD is a mechanism for searching patient identities. It's a way especially for cross-community access. So you give it the information you do know about the patient. That might be demographics, it might be identifiers, it might be your own identifier or your affinity domain identifier. You send that out there, and the various cross-references within the various affinity domains determine whether they have a close enough match for policy. We have some other ones, PDQ, PICS, and PAM, our HL7 V2 space. Underneath that one, you see a PEMR, a PDQ-M, and a PICS-M. Those are FHIR-based. So a PDQ-M is just a simple FHIR search for a patient. There's 2 modes in there. One is a FHIR RESTful query. The other one is using $match. $match is really quite powerful in that the client just simply provides the information they know about the patient, similar to XCPD, and the server uses policies and algorithms to match the best match and returns a best match. Both modes are in there. Both are available. PICS-M is purely a ID cross-reference, so you can only provide an ID of some kind, an ID or an identifier, and if that ID or identifier is found within the PICS manager, the PICS manager will tell you all of the other IDs and identifiers about that same patient. So that's the patient identity, supporting infrastructure. The top box is all about security and privacy. I'm not going to focus there, although that's generally where I focus my attention most of the time. Um, and then, there's some others around provider identity or services discovery, like how did I find that FHIR endpoint to query? How did I find that XCPD endpoint? So those are provider services directory stuff. And then we have some workflows and other things. So I probably uh, have this slide in potentially a wrong position, but this is where it is in the slide deck. Because it really, mXDE is all about um, uh, consuming content using FHIR REST while the content was published using documents. So that's what this is all about. So provided if you looked only at the left-hand side, you would see documents, you would see document metadata and documents, much like XDS or MHD, much like everything the last couple of slide decks we're talking about. Consuming documents, as I mentioned earlier, is sometimes very important because you get to see all of the context and the provenance and that kind of stuff. But sometimes you can be overwhelmed by documents, especially when a patient has many, many, many medical summaries even. So which medical summary should I focus on? So mXDE says, well, you know what? We know number 3 on the screen, um, consuming RESTful FHIR resources. So here's a FHIR RESTful endpoint for consuming observations or medications or allergies or immunizations. And I don't want to be bothered by documents. I just want deduplicated medications. So just give me the medications that you see across all of the existing documents. And the logic could also say, hey, don't include medications that have expired more than 2 years ago. So you could have some policy as to how to further deduplicate or how to further refine the information. But there's some algorithm, number 2, that says, how do I pull the information from all of the available documents? How do I deduplicate it so that I don't have duplicate um, observation 1? But in this way, when they are consumed, they can be consumed as a typical FHIR RESTful query. Within mXDE, there's one additional feature that is, in my view, very important, and that is number 4, and that is for all of the resources that you might retrieve on 3, there will be one or more provenance resources associated with that resource. Those provenance resources tell you where did this information come from. So if I found a medication in 3 different documents, I would have 3 different provenance resources, each provenance pointing to those, one of those 3 documents. And in this way, if I'm consuming data and I see something unusual and I want to see, hey, what's the context of this unusual medication, I can ask for the provenance of that med. I can then retrieve the document and I can look at the context that's in the document to realize that actually this medication was given only in an inpatient setting 5 years ago because of some surgery, that kind of provenance back to the original document is critical in my view, but is often missing when you're just simply consuming RESTful information. So this is mXDE, and really the pink IHE has a QEDM profile that shows that orange. But IPA from HL7 FHIR is also showing how that orange happens. So it's mXDE is about the creation of the resources and the provenance, and not focused necessarily on the what is the 3 API, because there's plenty of examples of how to do RESTful queries. So I'm going to bring it back to IPS. I'm going to bring it back to the sharing of IPS. But in order to do that, we end up with some pretty complex diagrams. They're not nearly as complex, given that you've seen all of these graphics already. We've talked about the IPS on the far left. We've talked about how it can be a document, a FHIR document in this case. You've seen the IHE transports in the middle, all of the colorful pieces. You see the push model. You see the MHD or XDS, Health Information Exchange, and then you see XCA at the bottom. So these are just the transports. And then on the right-hand side, you see, well, you could have a document that comes out of the transport and you consume it, or you could run that document through mXDE and end up with FHIR resources where you consume it with something like IPA. So if you break down the diagram, it is not as complex as it initially looks. So this is fundamentally what the sharing of IPS profile is all about. It's saying, hey, you have an IPS on the left, you want to consume it on the right. We have a bunch of transports, so let's just explain how that IPS document can be published or pushed or discovered and retrieved and used. So this is another view of kind of the same information. It's focusing on a little bit more of explaining it in more of a diagram model. But essentially, you have the very same thing. On the far left, you have source systems that are creating an IPS. Maybe it's going up to the MHD document source. That MHD document source under number 1 up there is pushing it using RESTful or document reliable messaging or XDM to a recipient who's consuming it. Maybe that document source is number 2, sharing it through some health information exchange. And this set of blue diagramming is just kind of showing abstractly a HIE that's talking about document repositories and recipients and initiating, responding gateways. It's just got a bunch of keywords, but ultimately some document consumer pulls the document and consumes it. And then in the far left, the bottom number 3 there is we're reminding the reader that IPS is a summary document, and therefore the on-demand method or on-demand flavoring of document sharing is really useful, because I can say, hey, I could create you an IPS, that's going to be fresh versus, one that I stored here 2 years ago. And when a recipient pulls that one, a fresh IPS is created that gets returned to the document consumer, and it also gets persisted. And this on-demand document source is really the document sharing terminology that could be backed by what is described in the HL7 IPS specification as $summary. So $summary would be a way to implement this. The XDS document on-demand mechanism is a way to cause that to happen at a distance versus a clearly client server only. So this is across a health information exchange. This is just going to build the same thing. I think I've covered that well enough. I don't think there's really anything more here, except that it does break down things like, well, this is just XDS versus mHD S. Just kind of a term that I haven't really described, but mHDS is everything that XDS is and more, but using only FHIR. So mHDS is a health information exchange, has no SOAP in it. It only has FHIR. So we do have a purely health information exchange model that is document sharing, has patient identity, user authorization, audit logging, all of the things that are made up of a health information exchange, but using only FHIR. It could be implemented with one FHIR server. It might be implemented by many FHIR servers. And then this one here builds to throw in the XCA model. So this is going to summarize what I kind of said. And really, you see there's 4 bullets on the screen. The detailed requirements of SIPS are really very basic because it's assembling a bunch of things we have around in a way that helps the reader understand and the implementer focus and the testing be focused on that as well. So content creators in the SIPS, they must make a HL7 FHIR IPS implementation guide compliant document. So in this case today, it is a very specific HL7 FHIR IPS. We probably will, once the CDA one is published with its updates, we'll probably add that to this, and there'll be 2 options. There is a format code for the IPS, so that if I want to look through a directory using that metadata, I can say, hey, just tell me about IPS documents that you have available. So there's a format code. That's a specific kind of metadata element. Content creators and content consumers must be grouped with one of the document sharing transports: XDS, XCA, XDR, XDM, mHD, mHDS. So you have to have some kind of transport. Otherwise, you're just HL7 FHIR IPS. So IHE is saying, hey, we have document sharing transports. So SIPS is about sharing IPSs. Therefore, document sharing transports are a requirement. And then content consumers have to do something useful with the content. We don't actually describe any particular thing that you have to do with the content. There are some options in there that you can declare, like, oh, I only allow the user to view it, or I only import it, those kinds of things. So really, the requirements are rather basic if you know all of these other modules exist. But if you didn't know that all these other modules exist, the SIPS brings them nicely together in a package. So like we were talking before, where we're kind of expecting an IPS to have regional specializations, we do expect that SIPS will also have some specializations. We're in discussions with like the EMS and EMT environment to leverage SIPS to get them a medical summary of the patient once they've identified the patient at a source. So we're looking at being able to leverage the SIPS. There are some other variations on the IPS that are within the PCC committee. There is an occupational data for health option that adds a social history section to the IPS. There is a maternal health antepartum summary that adds the delivery section. So there are within IHE some specializations of IPS as well. All of those can fall within SIPS because SIPS is really just about document sharing. So what do we do around testing? And this is the last slide. So IHE's Connectathon is a testing event. Mostly are in person for about a week long. There were some virtual things during COVID. There could potentially be some of those as well. There are specializations of these in regions called projectathons. Projectathons take a region's project and specialize the profiles, specialize the testing to those specialized profiles, and maybe adds some additional emphasis here and there. So regional specializations are projectathons, and those are based upon the generic connectathon testing. So we utilize the HL7 IPS conformance tests that MITRE works on creating validation tools. Those are using the structure definition profiles in the HL7 FHIR implementation guide. So our testing of IPS will start with being the same kind of testing. We have some testing that PCC has brought forward to say, well, we want to make sure that these optional sections are filled out when they do have data. So we will have testing environments that have a fixed set of data, and you need to produce an IPS that has those content. So we're testing more deeply than just, yes, it doesn't have a syntax error. The testing also includes the document sharing testing, and we've been testing, document sharing, whether it be mXDE or XDS or XCA. All of those, we have test tools available from Connectathon. So really what we're talking about is 1, 2, and 3 together, and that is we will see content go between two testing partners. We will test that they're using properly document sharing, and we'll test that the content being communicated is a proper IPS content, and further if there's further options declared or region projectathon requirements, those would be further testing upon that. So it's layers upon layers upon layers. And then number 4 is really just talking about these options as well. So that's what I have available to you. The SIPS profile is available at the link given. From that, there is other information available as well. So I'll take questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. Kari had one early on in the chat on human readability. Is the requirement to have that part in the document itself, or can it be created by viewer or etc., based on computable content of document created without meaningful narrative? I guess this is about the properties of the document.
Yeah. The human readability principle that comes out of CDA is one of those that you kind of have to tilt your head a little bit and go, okay, because whether it's CDA or it's FHIR, I think their intention of human readability is that even opening that up in pure text mode, you can read the content. It's not a binary format that is impossible to see. I think that's their minimal bar for human readability. I think, though, you will find that IPS for sure has requirements about human readable narrative in the sections. So there is a section by section intent to have human readable narrative that summarizes that section. So in the medication section, there has to be a human readable narrative that summarizes the medications. Now, it's not intended to meet the same specificity requirements as the FHIR encoding of each of those, but it's intended to say at least, there should be something that can be displayed to a user who doesn't have the ability to understand FHIR. I think third, which is part of the question, um, because these are standards based, you do not have to have a vendor specific viewer. You just need to have a standards viewer to consume it and make it available. So I think, yes, like I said, you have to tilt your head a little bit and kind of go, well, is that really human readable? But that's the intention, is that it's not binary, I think, because there were options early on that were just purely binary, like a Word document, right? If you opened up a Word document in anything other than Word, it was completely unusable. So I think that was their intent.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Any other questions?
Yes, Michael. Thank you, John. Thank you for sharing this wonderful presentation. It just blew up my mind, and I have many questions. I don't know where to start. So the first question that comes to my mind is that, first, as a novice, where should one start? That's my first question. The second question, for an organization, where should it start?
Yeah, and I think the answer to both of them starts with start anywhere. There is no best place to start for any of this. You just have to know that you didn't start at the best place. And therefore you have to constantly be looking for, well, okay, how do I fill in that gap that I didn't quite understand? There certainly are, that said, there certainly are plenty of summarizations of the various topics that I touched on. Usually the standards organizations have good summarizations, but in this case, since we were focusing on IPS, the IPS website is really fundamentally a great place to start. And the reason why that is true is that that IPS website had as a audience expectation that patients themselves might come and want to learn something. Therefore, they start with an expectation that the reader is interested and willing to learn and willing to go find more information, but that the reader doesn't come with CDA knowledge, and therefore we can just build on CDA knowledge. So in this case, that website it would be my recommendation. And I think the answer about whether it's an individual or an organization, I think are both. I don't know, Mikhail, if you would agree on that. You might certainly have some better
And well, for me as an app developer, where I start with my best interest, what kind of app I want to develop. And since I'm a modern app developer, I start with the FHIR flavor of IPS, and then I attend some of the FHIR calls and check out the discussions in Zulip and so on to learn more about IPS. And of course, I dig out my code editor and start implementing IPS with my own data, trying to craft, okay, how would it look if I put all my data that I know of into the IPS? And that's been a great way to learn about.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Start with a sample of the data. Because if you start with the sample of the data, you will start to look at it and pull it apart and then learn more and learn more. And there are samples of FHIR IPS documents up on that website. Yeah.
I have another question from an earlier meeting this week on Monday. We pondered in, I guess, the Nordics on FHIR call, how close are the different IPS specifications to each other? We had some views, but we'd like to learn yours. Now the
You mean
CDA
like
flavor,
between
the FHIR AP flavor.
the FHIR flavor and the CDA flavor?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, CDA flavor was just recently balloted in an update that aligned it with the FHIR flavor. I don't have deep enough knowledge of that particular specification, but my understanding was that was kind of a catch-up. So prior to that version, which is still just ballot, the previous CDA IPS was quite a bit behind, which is why for SIPS, I focused only on FHIR IPS, because at the time we surveyed and there wasn't much interested in the CDA version of IPS. Since then, I think some people have come forward saying, "Oh, we didn't know that that's what you were talking about." So the CDA version has been updated. I I believe so. Here's my personal hat. I think the FHIR version is always going to be more technically specific, because the FHIR tooling for creating structure definition profiles and all of the tooling around specifying and validating are far more mature than the CDA equivalent of that. The CDA equivalent of that is coming up to speed. It's coming up fast. But the tooling historically around use of structure definitions and implementation guide for CDA is brand new. Historically, CDA has been well ahead of where FHIR was, when FHIR first started. So they've been, doing this. I don't have any opinion on which one is better or worse.
Wasn't asking that particular, more
Yeah.
about how compatible they are. If you do one, is it easy to make automatic transformations between them and so on? So that was the main
Yeah, I
part
think
of the
with the
discussion.
with the updated, once that gets published, I think you'll see parity. But I also know that the FHIR IPS continues to evolve, and it's unclear how the CDA one will continue to keep pace with it. So just this week, we added some additional checks and balances, and it's like, okay, had deep discussions around UCOM versus SNOMED when it comes to units of measure. And I don't know how that when that'll get into the CDA version. So
And probably you're also not sure whether there will be FHIR IPS 1.1 or 2.0, or how that will get published.
yeah.
Things
But I think
do get evolving.
generally speaking, the concept is solidifying.
Yeah.
So what is an IPS fundamentally is pretty solidified. So I think if there's differences, they're I'll say small. They're obviously important to have had, one advance over the other, but I think we're talking some less important things than getting the fundamentals, which are available in both of them today.
Let me widen the context a bit. So in Europe, we currently have the My Health at EU infrastructure that supports sharing of patient summary data across borders within Europe. And there we use the term EPS, European Patient Summary. And that is based on CDA. And that's a big discussion now. We have the upcoming legislation, EHDS, European Health Data Space, and that talks a lot about data sharing and puts requirements for electronic health records, how they need to expose the data and so on. And there's quite a bit of discussion on, okay, should these formats be based on CDA or FHIR? And of course, there are countries, there are jurisdictions that have put a lot of effort into CDA architecture in the past, and they feel that it's easier for them if we would just all stay with CDA. And then there are some other countries that may have nothing ready, and they would say, okay, why would we start with the old standard if everybody thinks that FHIR is the way forward? We don't want to start there, we'd rather start from scratch with FHIR. And it may be that we'll have both and some kind of transformations of those. But that's the big discussion here. And that's why I think what you mentioned about it applies to patient summary, but also the mXDE. So how do you access data elements from CDA in this case, and also this transforming? So in here, the kind of starting point would be that you have the CDA version, and how do you create transformations out of that?
Yeah. So I bring this one up because this is kind of one of those answers, right? Which is, hey, just make the publishers of data produce both. There is this transforms relationship, so people will not get confused that this is two different documents. They are a logical transform of one. I very much recognize this CDA. Hey, I've got developers who understand CDA. I've got code that does CDA. None of them understand FHIR, so I'd rather have a CDA version. So I think this is one of these answers in that, well, you could have if you want to have your dominant be CDA IPS and then create a FHIR transform of that, you do it that way. Either way is fine. If they need CDA, they can retrieve CDA. If they need FHIR, they can retrieve FHIR. And then the other one is the other topic, which is, well, the consumers probably don't want to deal with either one of them. The consumers just want to deal with FHIR REST. So give the consumers, this environment where you're placing the burden on this service, number two service, that has to consume both CDA and FHIR content, producing the same FHIR RESTful resources that are deduplicated with provenance back to the original. So I think between those two things, you can have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. I think this is a very powerful diagram because there's so many consumers apps that don't want to deal with documents, and I don't blame them. Consuming documents is great if you need all the principles of document, but once a patient has been around for 60 years, there's a lot of documents, and which of these documents are not relevant? Well, have some logic in the service layer that determines what's relevant. So yeah.
So regarding that, having the cake and eating it to having both support for CDA and FHIR. Do you have any argument or any estimation how much should a, let's say, government agency estimate that it costs? So what would be the implementation cost of somebody who already supports CDA fully and is just starting with FHIR? And how can they get that investment back in the future, perhaps?
Yeah, if you've got some capabilities in CDA land, it'll be far easier for you to do the CDA version of IPS than it will at all be easy for you to do the FHIR. I think the thing that kind of puts that theory in question is there are a lot of the EHRs who are supporting FHIR RESTful query endpoints. So they themselves are becoming familiar with how to convert their internal data model into FHIR. Once you know that and you have a well-formed transform, then it's just a matter of, quite literally over here under 3, just to, be crazy. It's just a transform app that says, oh, how do I create a dollar summary? Okay, I do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So theoretically, if you've got a mature FHIR API or FHIR model, even if your database is not FHIR, creating a FHIR IPS should be, just transforms as well. But if theory and reality were the same thing, we wouldn't have 2 different words. So, reality always gets in the way.
Yeah. I guess in Finland, one of the aspects of reality is that we have this IHE, the information exchange called Kanta, a centralized repository, and they just had an open discussion on this. How would they move from CDA to FHIR? And I guess some of the burden for them comes from the fact that they are really just a database and they should be the custodian of the information that EHRs push there. And if EHRs push CDA data, are they kind of allowed to transform that into FHIR for apps that would like to consume FHIR?
Hopefully, yes.
Me too. Hope so too. They felt a bit uncertain about that. And I think the proposal was that systems, the EHR should start to push in FHIR data, and that's how the data would gradually be transformed over to FHIR. But that's a long way, I think.
I think honestly, have them push both. Yep. They are the far more capable of producing both. The consuming side is far less capable of consuming both, I think. Usually the consuming side has to pick one or the other. They can't pick to do them both. But an EHR or even an health information exchange, these are established environments. Make them produce both with a transform.
A side question related to mXDE, are there products available that one could use? I've seen some projects in, I guess, Austria, Switzerland, doing these transformations in open source from local CDA to FHIR. But do you know of anything beyond that?
I'm never hooked into that environment to know. I think I've heard of a few like interface engines that support it. I've heard of a few. Health Gorilla in the U.S. here does it, but none of them declare themselves as mXDE. They just say, "Hey, we'll create FHIR RESTful." And it's like, well, okay. Do you have the provenance? Because if you don't show provenance, you're just creating data that's disconnected from reality. So, anyways, yeah, I'm not connected well enough.
All right.
But if you do hear about it, we can add it, especially open source. We do have a website on our wiki where we point at open source that are available.
I do realize we are well over time, but if
Yep.
you still have a couple of minutes, we still have some questions.
Sure.
So Kari has one in chat. Which is harder, transform between formats or produce in two formats to begin with, plus handle version management between them, as transforms have tendency to cause some information loss or be otherwise problematic?
Yeah, I agree. And I've certainly worked with my own transform experience. Yes, transforms tend to lose something, which is why you declare the output of a transform as a transform. Therefore, it's been checked for general quality, but there might be, something that was lost in translation, so to speak. But if I think to create the both contents from your original database means that you have to have two totally different technology stacks and totally different intellectual resources, because generally people are probably your limiter there. It's not too common to have someone who can understand both CDA and FHIR. Yes, they exist, but you're much more likely to get somebody who can understand CDA or learn CDA. So I think it would be more expensive to create both from base. But I still think they would be, obviously in document sharing, they can be transforms. But that's one of the benefits of declaring the second one as a transform, is that, okay, it might have some less things, but its quality should be checked, that it's not less in a fundamental way.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. But I also ask, is there a variant of mXDE that operates on top of hybrid data store, i.e. in some sources are CDA, some are FHIR, and there's no conversion engine, e.g. number 2 in the diagram?
Yeah, I the way mXDE is described, the format of the content in blue is not declared. So it could be CDA, it could be FHIR, it could be PDF. You could be doing, natural language processing to produce the things. What your algorithms are is product invention. So no, we haven't declared that it has to be sourced as FHIR documents or sourced as CDA documents. So that would be a product requirement.
I guess that was also related to the discussion that we have in Finland and how to transition from CDA to FHIR, and should we have some kind of overlap, and how do we build the transition steps?
Yep.
Will be interesting. You ended up with testing, so can you share how the IPS has been tested in IHE? I know that it has been around in FHIR connectathons, where the specification is being tested, but for real-world implementations in IHE, how many have there been, and what's it been like?
Oh, I went too far. The testing of IPS, our approach is to use the HL7 test toolings. So what you're seeing happen at a FHIR connectathon is, from a pure IPS content testing, the same tool that we use in IHE. So we use modular tooling. So it's just a modular tooling. That is, if all we're dealing with is a base IPS. If we're dealing with an IPS that also conforms to, the EMS or maternal health or one of the other profiles, we add those on top of that. So it's or projectathon based stuff. So it's really we don't try to create a competing tool. We share, we work together, just like we're working together at the very beginning. There's no reason to have different tooling, at least at this point in time.
But do you know whether IHE already has had connectathons where
Oh, yeah.
IPS or SIPS have been tested and validated?
Yeah, a couple of years now.
Yeah.
And
also these
and
regional...
indeed, some people do come through IHE Connectathon only wanting to test the IPS content. So they don't want to do SIPS because they're wanting to only test their content. They don't want to test the transport at the same time. So yeah, it's very modular.
Good. About SIPS, do you know whether it's already used in real world scenarios?
Boy, I wish I could say I do know or not, but I just don't. And again, it's one of these that, the requirements are ultimately not that difficult. Therefore, do you need to come to a connectathon to prove it? And that's on purpose, right? It's on purpose. SIPS is really a effort to satisfy our role within the joint standards organization's initiative, and B, to recognize that many who would be entering the IPS space might not understand document sharing and might need to be spoon-fed what is document sharing. So SIPS is more, my goal for SIPS was far more as a educational opportunity than it was as a news shattering, new technology.
It doesn't need to be new technology, but using the existing technologies in a smart way. And I totally appreciate being able to take my IPS and share it with various ways, for instance, through media and so on.
Yep.
So all of those profiles are nice to have.
Yep.
All right, we are 15 minutes over already, so I think we'll wrap it up here and we'll continue in a month. Next session is on a Wednesday, not on Thursday. We usually have these on Thursdays, but the next one is on November 27th. That is a Wednesday and at the same time. And you'll be in standard time and then again.
Yep.
Now you're still in daylight saving. All right. Thanks, Lily and John. And
thank you very much.